Welcome to Unit 8. Glad you're here. We're going to take a look at all the wonderful pieces of this next unit. So, as usual, we are doing kind of really similar activities to what we've done in other units before. You're reading chapters 11, 12, and 13 of Thanks for the Feedback. You're watching this lecture video. You're doing your attendance and participation activity. You're doing the case study as well as your C and Qs. And if you have any questions, please reach out to me and feel free to refer back to the syllabus for what we're doing when. You've completed the midterm by this point, and we're starting to look towards the final paper, the final exam. Take a look at those this unit if you have time, and reach out to me if you have any questions. But I will keep mentioning it as we go along, as we look at the final paper and the final exam that are coming up in the next few weeks. So today we're going to be talking about Thanks for the Feedback tied to communication ethics. Thanks for the feedback and communication ethics. All right, so let's dive in without any further preamble here. So chapter 11 is looking at key frames. Key frames can help us navigate the conversation and the feedback conversation, especially. You have these moments that help you get a really clear look at what's been happening in the feedback situation. And they identify in the book three kind of key frames, key moments to keep an eye out for. And this is the opening of the feedback, the body or the content of the feedback, as well as the closing. So how does the close of the feedback session go? So each of these things, open, body, close. The opening of a feedback session has a lot to do with alignment. What kind of expectations are being set at the beginning of this conversation, and how does that dictate the way that the conversation unfolds as you go along? So first, the very first question that comes up is, what kind of feedback is this? If it is it feedback to begin with? And if it is, what kind of feedback? Is it evaluation, coaching, appreciation? We've talked about these three different kinds of feedback, and it's important to align and understand what's the goal of this at the beginning. If this is a feedback conversation, what kind of feedback is it? And then who decides? Well, when we go through this whole feedback session, who decides what counts as legitimate feedback? Who decides where we go from here? What kind of decision-making process is there in terms of the feedback? And then whatever decision is made, wherever we end up, is that a final outcome or is it negotiable? Especially like in job reviews or performance reviews, things like that. Sometimes there may be kind of preliminary period to the review, and there's a chance to make an addendum or to make some comments or to have some back and forth, some dialogue. So what does that process look like? And being on the same page about that can be really helpful in the opening phase of a feedback session. Next is the body of the actual feedback itself. And so the authors here give us 4 skills for managing the conversation, which are skills that we've touched on throughout this book, so they shouldn't be a surprise to you. But these are things that will help in the actual process of giving and receiving feedback. So there's the act of listening, of being able to take in what's being said, being able to discern what fits, what doesn't fit, asserting yourself, being able to also communicate effectively and confidently, being able to assert oneself. This doesn't mean stampeding over or steamrolling others, but it does mean being able to authentically communicate where you are and what your expectations are, and being able to do that in a confident, clear manner, right? Process moves. How does this unfold? How do we handle these kinds of situations? Is there a protocol? In a lot of organizations, there's a protocol for delivering feedback and for engaging with that kind of feedback. So there's process moves as well. And then finally, problem solving. How do we actually, because the point of feedback is to get to a place where change is enacted, where we're able to move from one place to another. So how do we engage in problem solving? The last section after the body of the feedback is closing. So the authors emphasize the importance of closing with commitment, closing with a clear, hey, this is what we're going to do from here. This is what's going to unfold. So there are different kinds of ways of committing, things like action plans that unfold maybe along with a timeline, right? Benchmarks and consequences if those benchmarks aren't met, right? Procedural contracts or new strategies, being able to unfold a new direction and plan. So these are some of the key frames that come out as we navigate a feedback conversation. Chapter 12 talks about getting going, right? It's about this moving forward and putting all these things into practice. And there are 5 ways to take action that chapter 12 emphasizes. We're not going to spend a whole lot of time here, but I thought this was helpful to briefly cover. So name the one thing. If you had one thing in this feedback session, whatever it is, that you need to walk away with, what is it? How can you hold on to it? Tie a string around your finger for that thing and hold on to it. Take it away with you. What is the one thing that really needs to improve or change or be different or worked through in the future, right? I've had many different feedback sessions where I get a whole raft of information and it can be hard to process. And so being able to hold on to that one thing lets you then enact it and really put it into practice. Number 2 is to try small experiments. If you're not sure if the feedback that you're receiving is a good fit, if it works for you or not, why don't you try some experiments to see if it actually makes a difference, right? Implement the feedback in a limited sense in your life and see if it starts to resonate with you, right? This is something that can be really helpful because sometimes we can be blind to the things that are so obvious to others. And so trying small experiments allows us to take feedback seriously in a controlled and measured sort of way. Another thing that the authors encouraged was to write out the J curve. And the J curve is this curve that it's like a J. So you have the start of the J right here, and then it curves, right? It curves. So you start your J, and then it curves, and you start at this midpoint here. And the idea of the J curve is that when we receive feedback that involves change from us, sometimes we can be resistant to that change. We can be afraid that if we make the change, then things are going to get worse, right? And this is the part of the J that curves down, right? And when we get down in this J curve where things are hard, there's the consequences of making change, maybe some short-term disadvantages or impacts for making this change, and we abort, right? We get out of it because we're afraid of this downturn. But really, if we were to possibly just stick it out, it starts to go back up, and then it actually exceeds where you were previously in the J curve, right? And that's that whole idea is if you stick out the negative impact, the growing pains of making change and implementing this feedback, then you'd actually be better for it, right? So sticking out the J curve, writing out the J curve. Coach your coach. Teach the coach that you're working with how you like to be treated and how you respond well to feedback, right? You're trying to set up a situation where both you as the person receiving feedback and the coach are successful, right? And then invite them in. The authors, in talking about this 5th piece of inviting people in, they talked about how everyone has a garden part of our personality of who we are, and a junkyard, right? We have the garden and the junkyard. And it's really easy to let people just see the garden, right? But it's hard sometimes to show parts of the junkyard. But when we do that, it builds trust. It builds vulnerability. It allows people to engage with us in a really human sort of way. And so being able to invite people into these areas as appropriate builds trust and builds teamwork in the future, that vulnerability, right? Chapter 13. This is the last chapter of the book, and it's talking about pulling together and feedback in organizations. We're tying everything we've been talking about together. This is the end of the book. And I really appreciated this. At the beginning of the chapter, the authors acknowledge that there's no perfect feedback system. Every feedback system has its drawbacks and its advantages. And part of what you have to do when you're implementing feedback is to understand what is the best fit for your organization, for the people you work with. And this isn't even just a one size fits all within an organizational context. It's about what works well for the people that you're working with, the mentors, the mentees, the people that you are on a day-to-day basis giving and receiving feedback from. So there's some helpful tips about what leadership in HR can do, about explaining trade-offs, separating appreciation, coaching, and evaluation, promoting a culture of learners. There are things in the chapter that involve what team leaders and what receivers can do when it comes to feedback. But this whole idea is, again, that there isn't a perfect feedback system. And because of that, it takes work. It takes collaboration. It takes pulling together at this. And it takes continuous tweaking, continuous learning, and being able to admit mistakes when we make them in the feedback process, and being able to then learn from them and create systems that allow us to better implement feedback in our own lives, but also in our organizations. Now, communication ethics, how does this come into this whole question? Well, we're going to be talking a lot more about communication ethics as we head into the conflict between persons text, which is written by one of the founders of communication ethics, Ronald C. Arnett, who I think we might have already briefly mentioned before in class. But his work, along with Janie Harden Fritz, we've talked about her in the context of public civility. Both of them are pillars of communication ethics, and they're both from Duquesne, which is wonderful. And they have been really instrumental in pioneering this idea of communication ethics. Now, communication ethics provides a framework for understanding what motivates people, how we come to the table with all these different competing opinions or backgrounds, right? And what communication ethics does is it positions all of these different ethics, these different communication ethics, as really coming from a place of narrative and narrative ground, and as being things that we can learn from. So let's unpack this a little bit and explain the concept a little more. You're going to have more in your case study work this week that's on communication ethics and the work of Ronald C. Arnett specifically, okay? So first, communication ethics is about protecting and promoting certain goods. So communication ethics is not so much a matter of black and white, of this is right, this is wrong. What it's about is the study of how certain ethics protect and promote certain outcomes, certain goods, right? So there are all kinds of different communication ethics, but one example would be democratic communication ethics. And democratic communication ethics is a framework that promotes and protects the good of democratic engagement, of being able to have respectful dialogue that pushes up against each other in terms of the public sphere and public policy and the way that our community should go. Like, democratic communication ethics could really be exemplified by a really well-run city council meeting, right? Or a town hall where everyone gets a chance to speak and a chance to weigh in and give input, but then we decide in a way that's democratic. We move forward through consensus, through voting, through a majority, but there's this framework that governs our decision making, right? And that's a communication ethic. There's many other communication ethics. There's a dialogic communication ethic. There are just 7 or 8 of them, I think, that Arnett and Fritz lay out in Communication Ethics Literacy, which is a great book you should check out if you haven't had a chance to. But that's what a communication ethic does, is it protects and promotes certain communicative goods, certain outcomes. And these flow from narratives, right? Communication ethics flow from narrative structures. And narratives, I can't remember if we've talked much about this, but narratives are made up of publicly told moral stories that tell you about how we should live. And then they're also made up of practices that flow out of those stories. And finally, they're made up of communities that buy into those publicly told moral stories and practices. One way of thinking about this would be Catholicism. Catholicism is a narrative, right, that has certain moral stories about how we should behave in the world, or what life should be like, what different things are in our society or in our world, how we should behave, right? There are moral stories attached to Catholicism, both scriptural ones, but also cultural moral stories. And out of those moral stories, there are then practices, right? There are the sacraments, are a great example of this. Whether it's communion or one of the others, there are these practices that flow out of a moral story within Catholicism. And there are people who buy into those practices, who adopt them and believe the moral story, right? And they enact the moral story through the practices. Do you see that? And so you get these narrative structures that bring people together, and that's what communication ethics is about. It's about protecting and promoting certain goods that flow out of those narrative structures. Um, and we can learn really what Fritz and Arnett are doing, are positioning communication ethics as an opportunity to learn. And so this is similar to dialogue, right? To learn from different communication ethics, not to find the right communication ethic per se, but to be able to learn from them in conversation with one another, to understand why they protect and promote what they do. All right. I think that's a good starting point here for you as you do your own work. I'm excited to hear what you come up with, and please reach out if you have any questions. All right. Take care.